called Philosophical Fragments. To this he had added a vast 600-page postscript entitled Concluding Unscientific Postscript to the Philosophical Fragments, a Mimic Pathetic Dialectic Composition, an Existential Contribution, written by Johannes Climacus, but published by S. Kierkegaard. This is the first appearance of the word existentialist, in its Danish form eksistensforhold. Condition of existence, existential relation. Kierkegaard had now written well over 500,000 words in the preceding 5 years, and not surprisingly found himself at a loss for something to say. So, in keeping with his philosophy, he decided to act, to create himself by making a significant choice. Kierkegaard's choice of action was characteristically perverse. A number of his pseudonymous works had received moderately favourable reviews in the magazine Corsair. This was Copenhagen's satirical scandal sheet, notorious for its vituperative attacks on local personalities. Kierkegaard now chose to goad Corsair into attacking him by publishing a snide letter attacking the magazine. One is insulted by being praised in such a paper, and revealing the identity of its anonymous editors, causing one of them to lose the chance of a professorship. The result was predictable. For several months, every issue of Corsair contained material attacking Kierkegaard and his pseudonyms. His appearance was caricatured, his clothing ridiculed, and his ideas held up to scorn. Previously, Kierkegaard had been noted as an odd character, a gifted writer and intellectual who had got religion and become a recluse after an unfortunate love affair. On the streets he had been recognized as a curiosity, but had otherwise attracted little attention. Now all this changed. As a result of the persistent stream of articles and sketches in Corsair, the bent, stick-thin little young old man with his crab-like gait, his uneven-length trousers, and his huge umbrella became an object of public ridicule. In the streets, urchins and young children would run alongside him, mocking him. Shopkeepers and reputable members of the public laughed openly as he passed by. Kierkegaard was a sensitive character, and his sufferings under such treatment can only be imagined. But the point is that he had brought it all upon himself. He'd known exactly what he was doing. One hires Corsair to make abuse, just as one hires an organ grinder to make music. So why did he do it? As one would expect with such a mixed-up character, the answer is far from simple. There's no doubt that this was a manifestation of the same martyr complex that had led him to taunt the older boys at school. There's no doubt also that the public neglect of his work had something to do with it. Kierkegaard was now 33 years old, yet he was still barely known as a writer. So if he couldn't become famous, he would become notorious. Beneath all this egoistic doublethink, Kierkegaard also had a more sincere and serious purpose, though not devoid of egoism and doublethink. He wished to be reviled by his fellow citizens so that he could become a better man. He would use them to make him a better Christian. If he wished to live the life of the spirit, which was the only life worth aspiring to, this was a way of encouraging himself to do so. If his earlier, lesser aspirations were at least partly unconscious, this was certainly not. And, of course, there was one reason that underlay them all. In the words of Kierkegaard's only contemporaneous equal as a religious thinker, Pascal, "The heart has its reasons, which reason knows nothing of." The reason that lay in Kierkegaard's heart was Regine. He wished to draw himself to her attention, to show her how much he was suffering. But if his intention was to captivate Regine, he evidently failed. Around this time she became engaged to someone else, and a year later she was married. This hurt Kierkegaard deeply, though he didn't show it. What did show was the premature aging in his wizened features. The intense years of suffering, asceticism, isolation, and constant mental exertion were beginning to take their toll. Yet for all his ever-deepening insight into the human condition, he still clung to his impossible illusion, dreaming that one day he would somehow be united with Regine. On Sundays they still noticed each other in church. In April 1848, Kierkegaard had a religious experience. "My whole nature is changed," he wrote in his journal. He realized that only his love of God could protect him from excessive self-concern. From now on he would preach the word of God directly, no longer hiding behind pseudonyms. This he proceeded to do in another stream of books, 6 works in the next 3 years. Kierkegaard's view of religion is plainly mad, fit only for saints and dedicated misanthropes. In his view, the whole of human existence is opposed to God. At the core of Kierkegaard's religion, as also at the core of his psychology, is the notion of the fall, humanity's lapse from grace in the Garden of Eden. This was egoism whose main manifestation was sex. As usual, it's all the fault of women who come out of this rather badly. Woman is egoism personified. The whole story of man and woman is an immense and subtly constructed intrigue, or it is a trick calculated to destroy man as spirit. The only answer is celibacy, on a universal scale. The will of God will be fulfilled only when the entire human race has died out. Astonishingly, in the midst of this hilarious rubbish, Kierkegaard continued to produce worthwhile thought. Once again he launched into his philosophical bête noire, Hegel, producing a devastating critique intended to demonstrate the fraudulence of Hegelianism and the pathetic inadequacy of its claim to explain existence. Kierkegaard insisted that it was impossible to understand existence intellectually by merely constructing a vast system around it. As soon as one identified existence with rational thought, there was no place for faith. In Sickness unto Death, Kierkegaard analyzes despair. This he sees as the failure to will to be the self which one truly is. This is dangerous ground. In fact, Kierkegaard's assertion here contradicts his earlier claim that the self does not exist as being, but as becoming. It presupposes a self which one truly is. Kierkegaard fudges this issue by later speaking of the self that one potentially is. But does a true self, or even a single particular potential self, exist for every individual? This is a fundamental issue. There is a categorical difference between using one's various potentialities, which may be contradictory or even mutually exclusive, and aiming for some hypothetical true self. Most individuals are, at the outset, faced with a variety of life choices, each of which may include him remaining true to himself, that is, fulfilling some or many of his potentialities. It is not possible to fulfill all one's potentialities. Albert Schweitzer was a musician of professional standard, but chose to devote his energies to missionary work instead. Which was his true self? As with many who encourage us to become our true selves, there is a hidden agenda here if this true self is already fixed. And if it isn't precisely fixed, surely it is still possible to speak of discovering one's true self. No. Discovery involves something that is already there, even if it is unknown. The best argument against self-discovery is one previously used by Kierkegaard himself. He spoke of using choice to create oneself. This is the true and angst-inducing freedom that Kierkegaard insists upon elsewhere. But back to despair. For Kierkegaard, unconscious despair results when an individual identifies with something outside himself. This can be trivial, wishing to become the next Einstein, or the pinnacle of ambition, marrying Madonna. In either case, this leaves the individual at the mercy of fate. Someone else becomes Einstein. Your proposal is heartlessly spurned. Because he doesn't achieve his ambitional self, the individual cannot bear to be himself. The result is an inner emptiness, accompanied by an unconscious wish to be dead. Conscious despair is aware of itself. This comes in two forms. The false notion of conscious despair occurs when an individual knows he despairs but imagines that others do not. No one knows the way I feel. This drives him to even greater despair. The true notion of conscious despair realizes that despair is in fact part of the human condition, and as such a part of every self. This true despair is thus conscious of belonging to a self. The only way out of despair is for an individual to choose his own self and make the leap of faith. Here Kierkegaard reveals his hidden agenda. The only true self is the believer. Kierkegaard continued to write furiously into his early 40s. He was now aged beyond his years, and his money was beginning to run out. He needed to find work, but there was only one job he could possibly do: become a pastor. Although Kierkegaard appears on one level to have accepted this state of affairs, something in him definitely gagged at the prospect. He objected on principle to earning one's living from one's religion, and his idea of Christianity was not shared by the established Church of Denmark. A church that allowed married pastors was unlikely to preach universal celibacy. Kierkegaard decided it was time he exposed the charade of Christianity as it was preached by the Church of Denmark. Regardless of his shrinking funds, he launched a magazine called The Moment. Editor and sole contributor S. Kierkegaard. In it he attacked the Church as a machine, castigating one of its much-loved bishops as a worldly hypocrite. To make matters worse, he was also a Hegelian. In one issue he even suggested that if it was discovered Christ hadn't existed, the Church would go on just as before, and few pastors would resign their comfortable livings. As expected, this caused a great scandal. There was now no chance of Kierkegaard losing his freedom. Any employment as a pastor was out of the question. In many ways it was the Corsair incident all over again. Once again Kierkegaard had achieved fame and widespread attention. His articles were quickly translated into Swedish, and the controversy raged throughout Scandinavia. The world was paying him what he felt, consciously or unconsciously, was his due. But it was fame in the only way that Kierkegaard could bring himself to accept: notoriety and execration. At the same time, it's not difficult to see an echo here of the young Kierkegaard Sr. cursing God on his hill in Jutland, and of course it once again drew him to the attention of Regine. Regine's husband had recently been appointed governor of the Danish West Indies, 3 tiny Caribbean islands. Kierkegaard almost certainly heard of this. How much it prompted the launching of The Moment can only be guessed. In April 1855, on the morning of her departure to the West Indies, Regine contrived to encounter Kierkegaard in the street. She paused and said quietly to him, "God bless you. May things go well for you." Kierkegaard raised his hat, politely exchanged greetings, and they passed on their separate ways. This was the first time they had actually spoken since their broken engagement 14 years earlier. It was to be the last time they set eyes on each other. Increasing frailty, combined with the stress of conducting his campaign against the Church, soon took its toll on Kierkegaard's health. 7 months after Regine had departed for the West Indies, Kierkegaard collapsed on the street and was taken to the hospital. He used the last of his money to pay the printer for the next edition of The Moment. Weak and in despair, whose topography he knew in such detail, he lost the will to live. But he never lost his faith. Those who saw him remarked on the radiant eyes that enlivened his emaciated face and his air of serenity. Within a month he died on November the 11th, 1855. In his will he left his few possessions to Regine. Kierkegaard's funeral attracted an unexpectedly large crowd, with students competing to act as his pallbearers. Just as Kierkegaard would have wished, a scandalous incident occurred at the graveyard. A group protested the hypocrisy of the Church, which was claiming Kierkegaard as its own by burying him in holy ground. Someone read out a vituperative passage from The Moment. Uproar ensued. Afterward. Kierkegaard was soon forgotten. Not until early in the 20th century did interest in his work begin to spread. His ideas became influential in Germany, where they were seen as a form of philosophical parallel to the newly emerging Freudian psychoanalysis. Kierkegaard's ideas were developed by Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, who attempted, unsuccessfully, to make the philosophical analysis of consciousness into a rational science. As is often the case with philosophic failure, this attempt proved philosophically stimulating and fruitful. Kierkegaard's ideas were taken a stage further by Husserl's pupil and fellow German Heidegger, whose influence over 20th century European thought remains paramount, despite his personal disgrace through compromise with the Nazis. Many referred to this new philosophy as existentialism, and Kierkegaard was generally regarded as its founder. Existentialism is the only Western attempt at an irrational philosophy. No one questions its success as such, only whether such a thing is possible in the first place. Unlike reasonable philosophies, past or present, existentialism is purely subjective. This should make it difficult to argue with an existentialist, but this has not turned out to be the case. Existentialists are famous for their arguments with one another. As with Kierkegaard, being, existence, takes precedence over knowledge, rationality. This philosophy was to be developed to its zenith, or nadir, by Sartre, who spent much of his existence studying his existence in left-bank cafes. The name existentialism has a curious history. After being inadvertently invented by Kierkegaard, it was forgotten, then revived by the Germans, then disowned. Both Husserl and Heidegger are being praised in such a paper, and revealing the identity of its anonymous editors, causing one of them to lose the chance of a professorship. The result was predictable. For several months, every issue of Corsair contained material attacking Kierkegaard and his pseudonyms. His appearance was caricatured, his clothing ridiculed, and his ideas held up to scorn. Previously, Kierkegaard called philosophical fragments. To this he had added a vast 600-page postscript entitled Concluding Unscientific Postscript to the Philosophical Fragments, a mimic pathetic dialectic composition, an existential contribution, written by Johannes Climacus, but published by S. Kierkegaard. This is the first appearance of the word exist. Kierkegaard's choice of action was characteristically perverse. A number of his pseudonymous works had received moderately favourable reviews in the magazine Corsair. This was Copenhagen's satirical scandal sheet, notorious for its vituperative attacks on local personalities. Kierkegaard now chose to goad Corsair into attacking him by publishing a snide letter attacking the magazine. One is insulted by existentialist, in its Danish form, eksistensforhold. Condition of existence, existential relation. Kierkegaard had now written well over 500,000 words in the preceding 5 years, and not surprisingly found himself at a loss for something to say. So, in keeping with his philosophy, he decided to act, to create himself by making a significant choice. He had been noted as an odd character, a gifted writer and intellectual who had got religion and become a recluse after an unfortunate love affair. On the streets he had been recognized as a curiosity, but had otherwise attracted little attention. Now all this changed. As a result of the persistent stream of articles and sketches in Corsair, the bent, stick-thin little young old man with his crab-like